This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to the 53rd episode of the Practice of Learning Teams podcast show. On today's show, Glynis McCarthy, Brent Robinson and I discuss psychological safety within the context of a learning team. We also talk about the 4 stages of psychological safety from the book of the same name by author and former CEO Timothy R. Clark. The links to the author's book titled The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, Defining the Path to Inclusion and Innovation can be found in the show notes. Please sit back and enjoy this discussion with us on psychological safety and learning teams. Well, team, I had a really fascinating phone call this morning with our good friend Rosa Carrillo in the US.
Oh, wow.
And Rose has been very kind to read the draft of our new white paper on everyday learning and providing us with some feedback, which has been really valuable. And during that conversation, the topic of psychological safety came up, and that whole topic that if we want workers to be engaged, we need to create that environment of psychological safety for them to become engaged. And I thought today that would actually have that sort of conversation, because the word is used a lot, but I sort of have this feeling that it has whole lots of different types of meanings. And I thought, let's talk about it within the context of a learning team.
Yep.
Because ultimately, when we run a learning team, the people that are going to participate in that learning team are going to come to that learning team with different views, different perspectives, different filters, and different needs. And it's no different. We don't expect everyone to be engaging at a high level. We expect that some people will want to contribute more than others. And that may be because they're just naturally reserved, or they may have had some previous life experiences, or it could just simply be a cultural belief that they carry. And you may recall that when we did that work around the PDCA model, we basically said that both preparation, having clear purpose, preparing for the learning team, communicating that to the stakeholders, and then empowering the learning team was vitally important. And we identified the difference between the role of the leadership in the learning team versus the role of the facilitator. And that, we want leadership to sponsor the learning team. And it may be that the leader starts the session and tries to, I suppose, establish that circle or establish those fundamental framework of psychological safety.
Brent, I like to really think about it in terms of you're taking responsibility for the group or for the team, right? You're as facilitator helping set those boundaries, and you're sitting in the fire, aren't you, at that point? You've got, as you said, you've got a whole bunch of people that are coming in there, 5 to 8 people sometimes, that are coming in there. And what you're trying to do as facilitator is be responsible for that group and help them move along the process, help them understand each other's points of view, but not necessarily, validating points of view, but not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with that point of view, and helping create that, foster that deeper understanding that you're trying to get from that group.
Yes. So we talked about that we want workers to be listened to. We want them to be respected as an equal, that everyone is there to share and explore, that we want them to be able to raise issues as they see it. We want them to be able to give ideas. We want those people to be acknowledged about their contribution and encouraged. And more importantly, we want them to be able to challenge as well.
Yep. I think
be
that's really
challenged.
important. That's important.
And then the last one is to be recognised as the experts or be recognised as competent in the work that they do. And I think that framework really sets people up to support that notion of, I suppose, in broad terms, psychological safety. Because I think, that if we think about buzzwords, this is not about trust. Trust is something that can't be sort of earned, if that makes sense. Like, it's up to the worker to decide if they trust in the process. It's up to the worker to decide if they trust in the facilitator. It's up to the worker to decide if they trust in the organisation. And we all know how trust can easily be broken. It's not difficult. It takes a long time to build it. It's really easy to lose it.
Yeah, you can destroy it in seconds, really.
But I think, establishing that frame, and I think every learning team is going to be different. And before we've spoken about the fact that, if you're using a learning team looking at an event, there is going to be an emotional element attached to that regardless. Versus if you're using a learning team to review a risk or to review an activity, to review an improvement, you don't have that same sort of emotional attachment or issues that may arise.
Yep. People
may be vocal, but we're not dealing with that emotion of misery that has occurred. And I think, Brent Robinson, you touched on it the other week. Workers have long memories, organizations have short memories.
Yeah, very short.
Yeah. So we expect that workers will share with us or tell us, or whatever way they want to communicate, stuff that they remember from the past.
And it's interesting when those things come out. So I'm dealing with a group at the moment that are in the middle of some industrial action, right? So they are bringing up things that came from 10 years ago, stuff that wasn't done in their mind or in their opinion. And the management team that they're dealing with has only been there for 4 years. So they don't have any context around any of these things. And it's really interesting to watch that, it really does come back to that worker memory versus organizational memory in this particular context to really understand. So, trying to get those two parties to see each other's point of view is actually relatively difficult. And that managed with the ongoing fatigue of COVID lockdowns certainly doesn't help. It's added a new dimension to these types of things as you move forward.
Yeah, so there's some latent trauma from the past.
Yep.
And that's being triggered by the presence.
Yep.
I don't think that you can say that you have, I don't think that psychological safety is a binary concept. So I don't think it's either there or it's not there. When you think about what is psychological safety, it's something around the belief that you believe that you're not going to be punished or humiliated or embarrassed or rejected because you put your thoughts forward. So that's really contingent then on making sure that the person who's facilitating the learning team has a really good understanding and really strong competency skills around how do they frame up a learning team. So, I think from a facilitator's point of view, they have to be able to do 5 things. They have to be able to make creating a space for psychological safety as a priority. They have to facilitate that people participate and the opportunities for people to participate, and certainly minimize when things start to become quite pointed or heated, but allow that the opportunity for discussion to take place and for conflicts to arise. They're the ones, the facilitator is the one that creates the norms on how conflict or difference are going to be mediated throughout that learning team. They create the space for new ideas, and they're the ones that embrace diversity. So unless you have a strong facilitator in a learning team, actually, I don't even think you get onto the starting blocks often, because all of those issues from the past can come to the fore, and actually it can just become, a free-for-all.
Yeah, I agree. Quite often you see things that need to be, you could call them a hot spot, and they're coming, and people will actually divert around them and not deal with them, And I think that's actually worse than trying to deal with them. You've got to work out how you're going to deal with them. You've got to poke around. You've got to validate the views from different parties that might be in that room, and then get everybody to get some level of understanding, even if they don't get agreement on it. There's some stuff we have to do there to make it work for us. And I think you're right that it's those. If you don't get those things right, you're not going anywhere. You're just going to go down a rabbit hole that you might never get out of.
And I think there's that conflict that it's that whole thing that we think we're trying to get common agreement, but in actual fact we're trying to get common understanding.
Yes.
And I think, Glynis, you have that classic saying that we're trying to get people to look at it through the lens of others. Mm. We're not asking them to become the other person. We're simply asking them to look at it through the lens of the other person.
I think in order for us to get psychological safety, it is based on a number of premises that, that people have to believe and accept that others have, different beliefs and different perspectives, different opinions, that people have different hopes, aspirations, that people have different vulnerabilities, that people have different allegiances and alliances, and that kind of what you were saying, Brent, that people ultimately feel that their contributions are going to be respected and appreciated, and that they're going to be acknowledged for their competency, that they are bringing something to the table. I think that unless in learning teams, unless there is an opportunity to determine our scope of a learning team and to determine psychological safety, I think that it can be really hit and miss. So again, for me, it's really one of the important parts of a facilitator is they have to set that scene.
Yeah. And I think, one of the other things that we should sort of touch on is when should the leadership be involved in the learning team? Because it's great for them to be involved at the beginning, just setting the scene. And then we should really bring them back towards the end of the learning team, where the learning team is able to present back to the leadership what they have found or what they have discovered, what they have learnt from that. Because all that good work, how much of something being misunderstood of what a leader would say, or how a leader might act, or even how the body language of a leader, like rolling their eyes or sighing, how much of that could then undo all that other work quickly?
It can, and I think you've got to, that's where I see some of the failures that we've all experienced. Is you get a leader in the room, and quite honestly, they're trying to be open and honest sometimes, but the message being received is based on the perception of the people in that room, right? And you're never going to align those two things. I think it needs to be short and sharp, and here's what we're, setting the scene, and then out. The worst ones I've seen is when you got the leader still in the room, because it just doesn't open up. It stays shut and very, very hard to break through and get any conversation going.
So that whole notion of communication as given versus communication as received.
Yes.
Sounds a bit like couples therapy. Which is basically, that whole notion that what one person says and how the other person hears, the fact, because look, all of us, including myself, there's a difference between active listening and judging. And we're all prone to want to judge information as we receive it because we're applying our own filter. I think we're all guilty of doing that.
You're trying to put it into your own context, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So any tips or tricks for people about that? About communication as given versus communication as received?
Brent, I'm surprised that you didn't rattle off what we were taught in adult literacy, and that was that you speak to communicate and listen to understand. you know yourself that when we're in a listening role, we typically are listening to think about how we're going to respond. And so again, I think as a facilitator, we need to model that, but we also need to pull people up when we're in a learning team and people start to really listen to what they're going to respond. So again, be very mindful of people and agendas. There's a really interesting book. It's by a fellow called Tim Clark from the States, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, Defining the Path to Inclusion and Innovation. And he's got some really interesting points. He talks about psychological safety running across 4 stages, and it's very much in line with what we've been talking about. Stage 1 is about inclusion safety. So I think that's kind of where you start off, isn't it? That's about, our basic need to connect with one another. That's that basic respect and accepting one another. Stage 2 is about learner safety. So that's about the possibility, opening up opportunities for learning by sharing ideas, asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, making mistakes. Stage 3 is about contributor safety. That's where you feel safe to make contributions. And this allows that kind of moderate risk taking, where we can test out some ideas, some assumptions without fear of retribution or being rejected or admonished. And then stage 4 is about challenger safety, when you feel safe to speak up and to challenge the status quo. And actually, I think that language sits really nicely with what we're sort of talking about. And that the role of the facilitator, I suppose, is really to read the participants, to understand where they sit in terms of those stages. Are they really new to this as a process? Is the organization new to this as a process? Then possibly where you would be sitting would be stage 1 and stage 2. Yeah. But actually, if the organization is more familiar, if they can see that there's a value in this, actually, chances are you're up at stage 3, stage 4.
I really like that point around inclusion safety. Because I've seen the negative side of that, where you've got a group together to discuss a particular issue or problem, and somebody has been left out. So when the fix comes along, because they weren't part of the original discussion, they're much more reticent to move to the new process. And we had an example of that last year, and we missed it. This particular person actually had some really good stuff that they could have contributed, but then felt that they were outside of the loop. And it's really interesting. So very much going back to your point about, I want to feel included, therefore I'm part of the discussion and part of the solution moving forward. So I like those 4 stages.
And if we think about a learning team, we have that physical break between the problem identification, problem clarity mode of a learning team, how we start it. Then we have soak time, and that then leads into problem solving, ideas and improvement. And I just sort of wonder whether that soak time actually aids in psychological safety as well, Glynis, because it's setting people up for that next component.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to what Brent Robinson has just said, I think it depends what the starting point is. If you come into this and it's very adversarial, I suspect you probably get stuck at probably the inclusion and the kind of the learner, the learner safety component, stages 1 and 2. If we were to, sit alongside what Tim Clark is saying, I think that quite often it takes a while. And if people aren't in a position where they can take interpersonal risk, if they don't feel safe enough to put themselves out there, then actually it's really difficult to get people to kind of progress and to do that reflection bit. Because by doing reflection, you now start to critique. Yeah. If you don't feel psychologically safe, you're often much more reticent to start to critique, particularly if you think that somebody else who's perhaps got an agenda or has more power than you is putting forward an idea.
Well, it's more likely you're going to defend, aren't you?
That's right.
Critique.
Absolutely.
And we see that.
And look, I try to reflect back in every learning team that I've been involved with. It's there's always like a set of characters that participate in the learning team. And you always find someone who basically is going to say at some point that they've said all the stuff before and nothing ever happens. And, one of my strategies is I get them to provide some clarity about what that was and get them to provide some examples or situations that was able to arise so that they feel that they're actually being listened to at that point. because they're saying it. They're saying it because they haven't been listened to in the past and they're trying to make a point. My job's not to apologise for what the organisation has or hasn't done. My job is to basically say, let's expand on that. Let's understand those circumstances, those areas about when those things arose, so that we can then build that in as part of that learning team process. Because sometimes I wonder if trying to sort of agree with someone actually doesn't actually help them move forward, because ultimately we're trying to get them to move forward. Would that be a fair comment?
I think if you sometimes agree with them, what you can do is say, in their view, I was right, and therefore it's exactly the way I said it was. And they can't move forward from that point.
Yeah.
Can they? We see that from time to time. I was talking to a CEO a couple of weeks ago about learning teams. He goes, so what is it? And I said, well, in reality, what you're trying to do is help people understand or hear each other. You're really trying to help people hear each other and and then develop some learning from that point. And he goes, And then he rang me up a couple of days later and he goes, okay, I quite like the idea. Makes sense. Right. So I think he might have had some reflection at that point.
I think he ran a little learning team in his head.
I was really pleased with that. It was one of those interesting moments.
I think it is really important that we do prime management about what a learning team is, particularly when they're new to it, because you're asking them to take this big, jump of, this big sort of leap of faith, aren't you? I think that, you do have to prime them to know that this is about allowing people to have their voice, to tell their story. It's an opportunity for learning to take place, both at the worker end, but also at the organizational end. And I think we need to prime the organization about what does that look like. Because I think sometimes they either see that it's going to be more than what it is or less than what it is. So it's really difficult at times to get people to come alongside and kind of, just go along for the journey, I suppose, and see how things unfold.
Yeah, I love it when someone says to us, well, what if we learn too much? Now, it's as though that these things, it's as though this link of workers imagined and workers done isn't going to happen regardless. And they're scared that if they now know, that it means that they're committed to doing something, when in reality, it's happening all the time. And we had that conversation the other day, Brent Robinson, about what's riskier from a organisation perspective, failing to know or failing to act.
Yeah. And that comes back to the legislation, those 2 points, doesn't it?
Yes, because the legislation has basically said the offending now is about failing to know.
Yep.
Because you have a duty to know.
I still think that some people think that if they don't know, therefore they can't be blamed for not acting. And that's why the legislation effectively changed.
Yeah,
so like you couldn't use it.
The blinkers, the head in the sand.
Yes.
Do we blame the 3 monkeys? Who do we blame? Who do we hold to account? Who do we, or if we use Carson, who do we hold for treason? Which of those damn monkeys cause the problem? Yeah.
I just going back to Glynis's 4 points, I really like that better than the word psychological safety, because it actually shows a progression through it, doesn't it?
It does, and I think you could actually extend it even further to the organizational kind of learning that needs to take place, and what does that look like? I haven't necessarily penned any titles for it, but I suspect that continuum does actually continue on. If we're looking at organizational culture that is wanting to be wiser as a result of having conversations about the complexities of how work is really being done, and actually really understand those complexities.
Oh, well, great food for thought for our listeners.
Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We would love to hear your learnings or other topics you would like us to explore about learning teams. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and give us your feedback. Become part of the community of practice with learning teams. Go to www.learningteamscommunity.com. Support the authors of the Practice of Learning Teams. Purchase the book from Amazon.com or go to www.learningteamsbook.com for an inside look and other free book resources from the authors.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.